Thank you for coming. This is our special book talk, book event with Val Vinokur, who recently came out with this book. Isaac Babel, The Essential Fictions, which are edited and translated from the Russian by Val Vinokur with illustrations by Yefim Lodezhetsky. And so Val, I've known Val for many, many years. Professor Vinokur teaches at the New School, where he is an associate professor of literary studies, chair of liberal arts, director of Jewish culture, and leads workshops in literary translation. He published a scholarly monograph called Trace of Judaism, Dostoevsky, Babel, Mandelstam, Levinas in 2008 from Northwestern University Press, but also has done, as you will not be surprised to learn, a great deal of translating. You might be surprised to learn that a fair amount of the translating is from French, together with his wife, Rose Réjouis. And I've read a couple of those. They're quite. Some of them from Creole, or are they all from French?
They're largely French, but French and Creole,
yes.
Creolized French.
Yes. So you have an informant. Yeah. And this book, which I assume it took many, many, many years. I sort of hope it took many years, because otherwise I'm going to feel very inadequate.
Three or four.
3 or 4 years. Okay, I'll accept that.
Plenty.
Is in one volume, if not the entire prose work that is non-dramatic work of Isaac Babel, close enough, or maybe as much as almost anyone who's not a die-hard Babel person would want. These are really the greatest hits. There have been several translations, in particular of Red Cavalry, Babel's famous collection of cycle of stories about the Russian war in Poland in the aftermath of the revolution. I think would this be the 4th or the 5th?
The 4th of the
something
yes.
like that. And I have to say, as someone who used to work on Babel and who was always trying to find good translations and used to teach Babel, I was always very, very frustrated, because there's certain, and also had to quote Babel, there are certain phrases, particularly from Red Cavalry, that are incredibly difficult to render. And every time I check on one of them in this translation, I'm so impressed that it actually sounds like English, which is not how it usually sounds in these translations, but also makes sense as a rendering of what is said in the Russian. I'm looking in particular in My First Goose. There's a wonderfully ambiguous thing when the narrator is told that the men in the regiment aren't going to like him, but if he messes up a fine lady, something like "Тогда тебе будет ласка." Which is, I remember looking it up. One said you'll get a fine caress, which I thought was, and I was writing about homoeroticism, but I thought that was like going a bit too far. And then the other was, I can't remember, but here we have, and the troops will adore you, which I think really, really works. And they might not be adoring them with his hands, or they might. It's just, leaving that to the imagination. And that's an example of the many, many difficult translating tasks that Val has so elegantly solved here. So if I ever get the chance to teach Babel again, it will certainly be this translation. But that's enough introduction. I think Val can certainly speak for himself. So we'll hear from him, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Elliot, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Heather and the Jordan Center for organizing this. And thank you for praising my English. There was a Spanish professor at Amherst who liked to say, I speak many, many languages, but English the best. Anyway, so I'll talk for just a few minutes about Babel, and then I'll do a couple of readings, or maybe Elliot will ask me a few questions right after I talk about Babel.
Who knows?
As the spirit moves him.
Yeah.
So Isaac Babel, in the spring of 1920, Isaac Babel, who was a short, asthmatic 25-year-old Jew from Odessa, took on the absurdly Russian-sounding name of Kirill Lyutov. If you translated that, it would be something like Cyril Savage, and joined General Budyonny's 1st Cavalry Army as a wire reporter, propagandist, and a staff personnel. Now, why would a non-Bolshevik Jewish intellectual ride with the Cossack vanguard of the Bolshevik Revolution? just as the Soviet Union sought to spread communism into what had just become the Second Polish Republic. Was it, as his friend, the poet Osip Mandelstam, would later ask him regarding his fondness for drinking at bars with members of Stalin's secret police, was it to touch the merchandise in the store where death is sold? To which Babel supposedly replied, no, I never touch. I just like to go inside from time to time to see what it smells like. Babel really had an artist's instinct for sniffing out life and death, and for finding or actively placing himself, or else imagining himself, in situations with as many culturally, aesthetically, morally stark contradictions as possible. He was an educated Odessa Jew among illiterate Cossacks. He was a Soviet soldier lodging with Hasidic Jews in places like Brody, where so many of Odessa's assimilated Jews had their roots. He was an admirer of Polish Catholic art among sacrilegious Soviet pillagers, witness to their perfidy and pogroms and their songs and their heroism. I would add that Babel's fate as an artist was closely aligned with the following very Jewish sentence in his childhood tale, The Story of My Dovecot. It's one of my favorite sentences in all of Babel. It goes, everything went as I wished, and everything went badly. That's what his narrator says just after buying pigeons for his new coop, his reward for getting into a coveted Russian school, and just before these same pigeons are smashed across his face during the pogrom of 1905. Everything went as I wished, and everything went badly. In a way, it's sort of the modern Jewish story, the Jewish century, in less than 10 words. Now, I began translating Babel in February 2014, the same month that Russia annexed Crimea, and the book was published on the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution. During the 1920 Soviet-Polish War, at the dawn of a long struggle between global ideologies, Babel found in Ukraine a tapestry of Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish civilizations coming apart at the seams along the borderland, along what had been, and is now once again, the Russian Imperium and the West. As a socialist Jew from Odessa who wanted to become a famous Russian writer, Babel himself wrestled with many of these identities while transcending them at the same time. The roiling dissonance and counter-harmonies of Babel's Red Cavalry rhyme with the noise of our own time, with the fraying of the social order that had negotiated between globalization, liberal internationalism, identity politics, capitalism, ethno-nationalism, and the welfare state. Now, as for how I came to Babel, I had emigrated from Moscow as a child in 1978, and a decade later, I was vicariously experiencing my own glasnost and perestroika, interrupted by the dull and regular crash of corporate minutes arriving on the dumbwaiter in the law firm where I worked. In Miami, Babel's words, full of horrified hopefulness, doleful and bespectacled Jewish comedy, sublime initiations into the bloody gyre of Russian history, Odessa gangsters in raspberry wingtips, long-legged Cossacks in their boxy black cloaks, thorns of supposedly detached prose that lodged in one's skin, all of this accompanied me into adulthood. Babel brought all the dissonant strands of my own life together in a lot of ways, from the fact that one of my grandfathers was a military commissar and the other was from a family that owned the Kitin department store in Vitebsk, and to the rather Odessan flavor of Jewish life where I grew up, the Miami beach of Al Pacino's Scarface. I went to high school with the son of Manuel Noriega's lawyer, Ray Takeoff, later unmasked as an FBI mole who helped put away a cabal of corrupt Dade County judges. When I left South Florida for college in New England, I felt a little like Babel leaving Odessa to make his name in Petersburg. At Amherst College, I immediately took a course on Soviet literature where I reread Babel. In Princeton, part of my dissertation, eventually revised from my first book that Elliot mentioned, was on Babel. Whenever I teach Grace Paley or Philip Roth in a modern Jewish literature course, there's Babel again. So he and I have been fellow travelers. And I wanted this book to be as comprehensive as possible without necessarily being complete. Babel wasn't allowed to finish either, after all. But I did include Red Cavalry, the Odessa Tales, the Childhood Cycle, and 22 other stories that I thought to be essential fictions. Another kind of obvious pun, because for Babel, fiction was essential to life, and the best parts of life were essentially striving to be fictions. As far as my process as a translator, Well, the most difficult and interesting part of the work involves distinguishing what is idiomatic and what is idiosyncratic in a literary text, all while being able to convey to a reader who cannot read the original that this is indeed a literary text. That's the first thing that you're trying to translate, that this is a work of literature. There isn't always a one-to-one correspondence, word for word, line by line, which means the translator needs to keep a running tally of what is owed the original in terms of its overall art, while accepting that the obligation, as Emmanuel Levinas would say, is infinite. All translation, like most things, is provisional. You translate the trees, yes, but all of that means nothing if you miss the forest. Is this interpretation? Of course, but so is the simple act of reading. So is the simple act of reading something out loud, as you'll see in a few minutes. A translation that is not a reading, that doesn't intone the text as a kind of performance, is just Google Translate, actually probably something less interesting than Google Translate. I could give you one example, it's really a meta example about translation from the story Guy de Maupassant, which is Babel's tale about translation, where the narrator describes his own approach to style as he edits someone else's amateur translation. And this is the line in Russian, the famous line. «Никакое железо не может войти в человеческое сердце так леденяще, как точка, поставленная вовремя». So if you wanted to translate very literally, it would be something like, no iron can enter the heart as icily as a period placed in time. My version of that in here is, nothing of iron can breach the human heart with the chill of a period placed just in time. In the pages of the New York Review of Books, I was much reproached for this.
But consider the source.
Consider the source. Who said all of these translations are interpret and are thereby not translations, but mine is the least bad. That's the blurb from the book.
That's the nicest thing he's ever said about anyone.
About anyone, right? He emailed me afterwards. It's a whole other thing. So I tried, in my sentence, I tried to evoke the rhythm, the length, and the timing, but also the soundscape of Никакое железо, etc. Babel's shivering mouthfuls of zhe, she, che, accordingly, breach, chill, just. Icily, which is the word that Saul Morson would have wanted, is an English word so silly it actually contains the word silly in it. On top of that, the Russian word for enter, vaiti, I think has a military resonance here, since it resembles vaiski, the Russian word for troops. Another reason I kept the invasive word breach. Anyway, such are the troubles and triumphs of translation. So now I could pause for questions, or I could read.
Well, just one thing I noticed about that particular example that I thought works so well is that one of the choices you're making, besides the phonetic choice, is to change parts of speech.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurs to me that that actually could be a very good solution in a lot of cases, given just how the syntax works. Is this something you found yourself doing often?
Yeah, it's something that I do sort of as a matter of course, because it's a puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
I know what effects I'm trying to get. I know what I want to, what I have to keep for myself, and then things like syntax and parts of speech and different kinds of idioms. Then I can play around with that.
Yeah.
I've always found it kind of puzzling. You know, Walter Benjamin's famous essay on the task of the translator. At some point, one of the few specific things that he says there is, you know, because he supports a kind of foreignizing translation, which I understand, but he says that, oh, well, the way you do that is you maintain the syntax, and I'm like, that's random.
Yeah.
Why the syntax? Why not? Why is the syntax more important or better or more significant than a literal word for word translation? Right? It's just there's no rhyme or reason there. There's no theory of language that would support that. Any part of it would be more important than any other.
And shouldn't all his texts in English then end with the verbs?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I think he said that because he was basing it on the translation of the Hebrew Bible that Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig did into German,
Mm-hmm.
which focused on the syntactical aspects. But you know, but translating syntax from Hebrew into German gives you so many options, right? I mean, you know, right? You know, if anything, German syntax is more complex and has more variables. You can actually make the Hebrew more interesting by sort of staying very close to the syntax. So, anyway, so you know, this is one of the things that David is going to write about is how very few reviewers know how to write about translation.
Yeah. No, it just seems like also once it was sort of a revelation, right? Once you change parts of speech, you have so many more options, and you're not stuck the way you are with isole, and so on and so forth. So I think that really helps.
Yeah, you have to have a full army of words and syntax and everything else, as Babel would say. There's no point tying your hand behind your back when you're translating. For me, anyway, that's what makes it fun. But translation makes a lot of people anxious.
It's like riding a horse that you haven't tamed.
Right. Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and read from this book?
Sure. So I was going to read one Odessa gangster story, and then 3 very short but very well-known Red Cavalry stories, Gedali, My First Goose, and the Rebbe, which are actually in order in the book, and they're each about, you know, a page or two, like 2 pages each. So I think this time around I will read, last time I read, at Yivo I read The King, but this time I think I'll read How It Was Done in Odessa, just to mix things up.
In case the groupies following from one event to another.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't think there's any overlap here, but just for myself. All right. How It Was Done in Odessa. It was I that began. Reb Aryeh Leib, I said to the old man, let us talk of Ben Yakrik. Let us talk of his lightning-fast rise and his terrible fall. 3 shades block the paths of my imagination. There is Froim, the rook. The hard steel of his deeds, can it really not bear comparison with the strength of the king? There is Kolkopakovsky. The rabid fury of that man contained all that was necessary for him to wield power. And is it really possible that Chaim Drong failed to see the brilliance of a rising star? Why did Benya alone climb to the top of the rope ladder while all the rest hung swaying on the lower rungs? Reb Aryeh Leib was silent, sitting on the cemetery wall. Before us stretched the green stillness of graves. A man who thirsts for answers must stock himself with patience. A man possessed of wisdom is arrayed in dignity. For this reason, Reb Aryeh Leib was silent, sitting on the cemetery wall. Finally, he spoke. Why him? Why not them, you wish to know? It's like this. Forget for a while that you have glasses on your nose and autumn in your heart. Quit brawling at your desk and stuttering in front of people. Imagine for a moment that you brawl in the street and stutter on paper. You are a tiger. You are a lion. You are a cat. You spend the night with a Russian woman and the Russian woman is satisfied. You are 25. If hoops were fastened to heaven and earth, you would grasp them and pull heaven and earth together. And your old man is Mendeldrick the drayman. About what does such a papa think? He thinks about drinking a good glass of vodka, about smashing somebody's face, about his horses, and nothing more. You want to live and he makes you die 20 times a day. What would you have done in Ben Yakrik's shoes? You wouldn't have done a thing. But he did something. That's why he's the king. And you give people the finger with your hand in your pocket. He, Benchik, went to see Froim the Rook, who already in those days looked at the world out of only one eye and was already then what he is now. He said to Froim, take me on. I want to hitch to your harbor. The harbor I hitch to wins. The Rook asked him, who are you, where are you coming from, and how do you live? Tell me, Froim, replied Benya. Try me, Froim, replied Benya, and let's stop smearing porridge on a nice clean table. Let's not smear porridge, assented Rook. I'll try you out. And the gangsters had a conference to consider the matter of Ben Yakrik. I wasn't at that conference, but they say there was a conference. Chairman at that time would have been the late Lyovka Byk. This little Benchik, what goes on under his hat? Asked the late Byk, and the one-eyed Rook offered his opinion. Benya says little, but what he says has flavor. He says little, but you want him to say something more. If so, exclaimed the late Bug, then let's try him on Tartakovsky. Let's try him on Tartakovsky, the conference resolved, and all in whom conscience dwelled blushed when they heard this resolution. Why did they blush? This you shall learn if you go to the place I will show you. We used to call Tartakovsky Yid and a half, or 9 holdups. Yid and a half he was called because no single Jew could have had so much money and moxie as Tartakovsky. He was taller than the tallest cop in Odessa and weighed more than the fattest Jewess. And 9 holdups he was called because the firm of Lyovka Buik and Company had raided his office neither 8 times nor 10, but precisely 9. The honor of carrying out the 10th raid on Yid and a half fell to Benya Krieg, who was not yet the king. When Froim informed him of this, he said yes and went out, slamming the door. Why slam the door? This you shall learn if you go to the place I will show you. Tartakovsky has the soul of a killer, but he is one of us. He came from us. He is our blood. He is our flesh, as though one mama had borne us. Half of Odessa works in his stores, and it was through his own Moldavanka lads that he suffered. Twice they held him for ransom, and once during a pogrom they buried him with a choir. The Sloboda thugs were beating up the Jews then on Bolshaya Arnutskaya. Tartakovsky got away from them and met a funeral procession with a choir going down Safiyskaya. He asked, "Who's that they're burying with a choir?" The passers-by replied that it was Tartakovsky they were burying. The procession got to the Sloboda cemetery. Then our boys took out a machine gun from the coffin and started raining hell on the Sloboda thugs. But Yid and a half had not foreseen this. Yid and a half was scared to death, and what boss would not have been scared in his place? A 10th raid on a man already once buried was a rude thing to do. Benya, who was not yet the king, understood this better than anyone. But he had said yes to the Rook, and that same day wrote Tartakovsky a letter similar to all letters of this sort. Much esteemed Reuven Osipovich, be so kind as to place by Saturday under the rain barrel, etc. In case of refusal, such as you have allowed to occur before, you will be met with a great disappointment in your family life. Respects from your acquaintance, Ben Zion Krieg. Tartakovsky was no slouch and replied without delay. Benya, if you were an idiot, I would write to you as I would to an idiot, but I do not know you as such, and God forbid I ever shall. It seems you want to behave like a little boy. Do you really mean you don't know that this year there is a crop in Argentina big enough to drown in, while here we sit with all our wheat and no customers? And I'll tell you, hand on my heart, that in my old age I am sick and tired of having to swallow such a bitter crust of bread and to experience such disagreeableness, having worked all my life like a beast of burden. And what do I have to show for all this endless convict labor? Ulcers, troubles, insomnia, sores. Let's drop this nonsense, Benya. Your friend, much more than you suppose, Reuven Tartakovsky. Yid and a half had done his part. He had written a letter, but the post didn't deliver to the right address. Receiving no reply, Benya was cross. The next day he turned up with 4 friends at Tartakovsky's office, 4 masked youths with revolvers poured in. Hands up, they cried, and started waving their pistols about. Take it easy, Solomon, Benya replied to the one shouting louder than the rest. Don't make a habit of being nervous on the job. And turning to the clerk, who was white as death and yellow as clay, he asked him, "Is Yid and a half on the premises?" "They're not on the premises," replied the clerk, who went by the last name of Mugen Stein, first name Iosif, a bachelor son of Aunt Pesia, the poultry dealer on Siridinskaya Square. "Well then, who's in charge in the boss's absence?" They started interrogating poor Mugen Stein. "I'm in charge in the boss's absence," said the clerk, green as green grass. "Then with God's help, open up the cash box," Benya ordered. And so began an opera in 3 acts. Nervous Solomon was packing cash, papers, watches, and monograms in a suitcase. The late Yosef stood before him with his hands up while Benya was recounting tales from the life of the Jewish people. "Forever playing the Rothschild, that one," Benya was saying of Tartakovsky. "So let him roast on a slow fire. Explain this to me, Mugen Stein, as a friend. If he receives a business letter from me, why shouldn't he pay 5 kopecks to take a streetcar and come see me at my place and drink a glass of vodka with my family and have a bite and whatnot? What prevented him from opening his heart to me? Benya, he might have said. So on and so forth. Here's my balance sheet. Give me a couple days to catch my breath and see how things shake out. What can I say to that? A pig doesn't talk things out with a pig, but a human being can talk to a human being. Mugen Stein, you understand me?" I understand you, said Mugen Stein, but he was lying, for he hadn't the remotest idea why Yid and a half, a respectable, well-to-do personage, would want to take a streetcar to have a bite with the family of Mendel Crick, the drayman. And in the meantime, misfortune traipsed beneath the window like a pauper at daybreak. Misfortune broke into the office with a racket, and though on this occasion it took the shape of the Jew Savka Butsis, said misfortune was drunk as a water carrier. Ho, 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 cried Savka the Jew. Forgive me, Benchik, I'm late. And he started stamping his feet and waving his arms. Then he fired, and the bullet landed in Mugen Stein's gut. What can one say? A man was and is no more. A blameless bachelor living his life like a bird on a twig. And now he has to die over some nonsense. Along comes a Jew dressed like a sailor and takes a pot shot, not at some carnival bottle with a prize inside, but at a person's stomach. What is there to say? We're out of here, cried Benya, and ran out last. But as he departed, he managed to say to Butsis, I swear on my mother's grave, Savka, that you will lie next to him. Now tell me, my young sir, you who snip coupons on other people's shares, what would you have done in Benya's place? You would not have known what was to be done. But he knew. That's why he's the king, while you and I sit on the wall of the second Jewish cemetery, blocking the sun from our eyes with our palms. And Pesya's unfortunate son did not die right away. An hour after they got him to the hospital, Benya showed up. He asked for the doctor in charge and the nurse to be sent out to him, and without taking his hands out of his cream-colored trousers, said to them, It is in my interest, he said, that the patient Yosef Mugen Stein should recover. Let me introduce myself just in case. Ben Zion Krieg. Camphor, air cushions, a private ward, provide all these things liberally. Otherwise, any doctor I find, even a doctor of philosophy, will get no more than 6 inches of dirt, 6 feet of dirt. But Mugen Stein died that night regardless, and only then did Yid and a half cry out through all Odessa. Where do the police begin? He wailed, and where does Benya end? The police begin where Benya ends. The police end where Benya begins, replied sensible folk, but Tartakovsky refused to take the hint. And he lived to see the day when a red automobile with a music box played its first march from the opera Laugh Clown on Siridinskaya Square. In broad daylight, the car flew up to the little house in which Aunt Pesya dwelled. The automobile arrived on thundering wheels, spat fumes, shone brass, stank of gasoline, and played arias on its horn. Someone sprang out of the car and made his way into the kitchen where little Aunt Pesya was flailing on the dirt floor. Yid and a half was sitting in a chair waving his arms. You thug, he cried when he saw the visitor. You bandit, may the earth spit you up. A nice custom you've taken up, killing live people. Monsieur Tartakovsky, Benya Krieg replied quietly. It's been 2 days and nights now that I've been weeping for the dear departed as for my own brother. But I know that you don't give a damn for my young tears. Shame, Monsieur Tartakovsky. In what kind of safe have you locked up your sense of shame? You had the gall to send the mother of our deceased Yosef a measly 100 karbavanets. My brain stood on end with my hair when I heard the news. Here Benya paused. He was wearing a chocolate jacket, creamy trousers, and raspberry wingtips. 10,000 up front, he roared. 10,000 up front and a pension till the day she dies, may she live to 120. Otherwise, Monsieur Tartakovsky, let's go outside and discuss this in my automobile. Then they barked at each other some, Yid and a half barking at Benya. I wasn't present at this quarrel, but those who were there, they remember it. The men agreed to 5,000 in cash and 50 rubles monthly. And Pesya, Benya said to the disheveled old woman rolling on the floor, if you need my life, you may take it. But everyone makes mistakes, even God. A huge mistake has been made on Pesya. But wasn't it a mistake on God's part to settle Jews in Russia and let them be tormented worse than in hell? And would it have been so bad if Jews lived in Switzerland, where they would be surrounded by first-class lakes, mountain air, and nothing but Frenchmen? Everyone makes mistakes, even God. Listen to me with your ears, Aunt Pesya. You'll have 5,000 up front and 50 rubles a month. Until death, may you live to 120. Yosef will have a deluxe funeral, 6 horses like 6 lions, 2 carriages with garlands, the choir from the Brody synagogue. Minkovsky himself will sing for your deceased son. and the funeral was held the next morning. Ask the cemetery beggars about that funeral. Ask the caretakers from the synagogue of kosher poultry dealers, or ask the old ladies from the second almshouse. Odessa had never before seen such a funeral, and the world will never see one. On that day, the cops wore cotton gloves. In the synagogues decked with greenery, their doors thrown open, electric lights were burning. Black plumes swayed on the white horses harnessed to the hearse. A choir of 60 led the procession. The singers were boys, but they sang with the voices of women. The elders of the synagogue of kosher poultry dealers helped Aunt Pesia along. Behind the elders walked members of the Association of Jewish Store Clerks, and behind the Jewish store clerks were the lawyers, doctors of medicine, and certified midwives. On one side of Aunt Pesia were the women who sold chickens at the old bazaar. On the other side, draped in orange shawls, were the honorable dairymaids of Bugaevka. They stamped their feet like gendarmes at a holiday parade. Their wide hips wafted breezes that smelled of the sea and of milk. And behind them all plodded Ruvim Tartakovsky's employees. There were 100 of them, or 200, or 2,000. They wore black frock coats with silk lapels and new shoes that squeaked like piglets in a sack. And now I will speak as the Lord God spoke on Mount Sinai from the burning bush. Put my words in your ears. All that I saw with my own eyes, sitting here on the wall of the second cemetery next to lisping Moiseika and Shimshon from the Undertakers. I saw this, I, Aryeh Leib, a proud Jew who lives beside the dead. The hearse drove up to the cemetery synagogue. The coffin was placed on the steps. Aunt Pesia was trembling like a little bird. The cantor crawled out of the carriage and began the service. 60 singers responded. Just then, a red automobile flew around the bend. It honked, laughed, clowned, and came to a stop. People were silent as death. Trees, singers, beggars, all silent. 4 men emerged from under the red roof and slowly approached the hearse carrying a wreath of roses such as was never seen before. And when the service ended, the 4 men placed their steel shoulders beneath the coffin and with burning eyes and heaving breasts walked side by side with the members of the Association of Jewish Store Clerks. In front walked Ben Yakrik, whom no one as yet called king. He was the first to approach the grave, climbed the mound of earth, and raised his arm. "What would you like to do, young man?" cried Kaufman of the Burial Society, running over to him. "I would like to make a speech," replied Ben Yakrik. And a speech is what he made. It was heard by all who wished to listen. I, Aryeh Leib, listened to it, and lisping Moiseika, who was sitting on the wall next to me. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Ben Yakrik. "Ladies and gentlemen," said he, and the sun rose above his head like a sentry with his rifle. "You have come to pay your last respects to an honest worker who perished over a copper penny. In my name and in the name of all those not present here, I express my gratitude to you. Ladies and gentlemen, what did our dear Yosef get to see in his life? He saw nothing worth mentioning. How did he occupy himself? Counting other people's money. What did he perish for? He perished for the entire working class. There are people already condemned to death, and there are people who have not even yet begun to live. And here comes a bullet flying into a condemned breast and cuts down our Yosef, who in his whole life had seen nothing worth mentioning. There are people who know how to drink vodka, and there are people who don't know how to drink vodka, but drink it all the same. And one kind gets pleasure from grief and from joy, and another suffers on account of all those who drink vodka without knowing how to drink vodka. And so, ladies and gentlemen, after we have said a prayer for our poor Yosef, I will ask you to accompany to his final resting place a man unknown to you but already deceased, Saveli Botzis." And having finished his speech, Ben Yakrik descended from the mound. Silent were the people, the trees, and the cemetery beggars. 2 gravediggers bore an unpainted coffin to the next grave. The cantor stammered through his prayers. Benya tossed the first spadeful of soil and crossed over to Safka's grave. All the lawyers and all the ladies with brooches followed him like sheep. He made the cantor roll out the full funeral service over Safka, and the 60 choir boys sang in response. Safka never dreamed of such a funeral. Take it from Aryeh Leib, an old man who has seen a thing or two. They say that on that day, Yid and a half decided to close up shop. I didn't witness this myself. But the fact that neither the cantor nor the choir nor the burial society charged anything for the funeral, this Aryeh Leib did see with his own eyes. Aryeh Leib, that's what they call me. And more than that I couldn't see because the people crept quietly away from Safka's grave then started running as if a house were on fire. They fled in carriages, carts, and on foot. And only the 4 who had driven up in the red automobile also drove off in it. The music box played its march, the car shuddered, and away it went. "A king," said lisping Moiseika, watching the car disappear. Moiseika, the very same one who takes all the best seats from me on the cemetery wall. So now you know everything. You know who first uttered the word king, it was Moiseika. You know why he didn't give that name to One-Eyed Rook or Crazy Kolka. You know everything. But what's the use if you still have glasses on your nose and autumn in your heart? All right, so I'll read a few from Red Cavalry, unless anyone had like a specific question about the one that I just read, or you can save it up for.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
You talked about the syntax, and there was
Yeah.
a line early in the story that said something like, "about which something Papa did not think." And you chose not to end that sentence with a preposition. And do you recall in the original how that was structured syntactically?
It
sounds so formal.
It's a very, very weird sentence. Ab chum dumit takoi papa.
So it's non-standard.
It's non-standard.
Yeah.
But is it of a formal register in the original?
So here's one of my insights from having translated Chamoiseau and from having translated Skaz in general, which is to say kind of orally inflected speech. A lot of translators, when they're confronted with this, go for a super folksy kind of, Cockney or whatever, or like film noir kind of thing. The interesting thing about this kind of orally inflected speech, especially when it's written, but even when it's oral, if anyone, the person who gets this right is more often is like David Milch.
Oh yeah.
The way that he writes dialogue, which sounds totally fanciful, but what he realizes is that people who are, effectively self-educated, they will overreach. They will actually make their syntax more complicated, right, or more biblical, because often the thing that they know is the Bible. So it will often sound more archaic, or some combination of the folksy and the archaic, because they're reaching for something. So it doesn't sound, it doesn't sound quite like the cliche of something low. So I try to keep that awkwardness, that it sounds both idiomatic and idiosyncratic at the same time, really. And also because in particular, that's how Babel's Skaz works, right? His Skaz is very much Babel's Skaz. Like his Cossacks talk like, if Babel were a Cossack. They sound beautiful and weird. So that's and I feel like this is a mistake that a lot of translators make, is that they say, oh well, I know how regular people sound like, so I'm gonna this is what it means to take license and make this sound like folksy, but there's no one-to-one equivalence with that. So you have to kind of invent this idiom that shouldn't sound exactly like something you've already heard before. The way that this came up when we were translating Chamoiseau is that, what do we do with the Creole? What do we do with the Creolized French? It's like, oh, let's make them sound like Jamaicans, and it's like, no, right? So we drew on sort of all of the dialects that we knew, including Yiddish, to kind of come up with this idea of what would Creolized French sound like in English, and it has to sound like something you've never heard before, because you've never heard it before. So, yeah.
It also sounds like it goes back to the question of a system they were talking about before, in that a lot of translators feel, okay, so this is a non-standard thing. I have to be non-standard in this particular moment.
Yeah.
When actually it might not be easy to be non-standard in this particular moment. Maybe it should be non-standard in a different moment to get the flavor of the language, rather than try to do it in this one particular sentence.
That's exactly right. That's why you have to keep a kind of running tally of what you've done and what you haven't done. So Pever and Bolokonsky, when they were interviewed about this, what Pever said is that translating prose is really like writing poetry, right? And it's not like translating poetry, but it's like writing poetry in the sense that, the setting and the characters, all of that is done for you, right? But as a translator, you have to create poetry out of it.
And yet they don't.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Yeah, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, so should I
Yeah,
read a couple
sure.
more? Okay, so I'm going to read. This is from Red Cavalry. I'm going to read Gedali, My First Goose, and the Rebbe. Gedali. On Sabbath eves, I am afflicted by the dense melancholy of memories. On evenings such as these, my grandfather would stroke the tomes of Ibn Ezra with his yellow beard. The old woman in her lace cap would trace fortunes with gnarled fingers over the Sabbath candles and sob sweetly. On such evenings, my child's heart pitched and tossed like a little ship upon enchanted waves. Oh, the moldering Talmuds of my childhood. Oh, the dense melancholy of memories. I roamed through Zhytomyr in search of a shy star. By the ancient synagogue, by its yellow and indifferent walls, old Jews sell chalk, wicks, bluing, Jews with prophets' beards and passionate rags on their sunken chests. Before me lies the bazaar and the death of the bazaar. The fat soul of plenty has been slaughtered. Mute padlocks hang upon the booths, and the granite paving is clean like the bald head of a corpse. She blinks and fades, my shy star. Success came to me later. Success came just before sunset. Gedali's little shop was hidden away in a row of others, all sealed tight. Dickens, where was your ghost that evening? In that little curiosity shop, you would have seen gilt slippers and ship's cables, an ancient compass and a stuffed eagle, a Winchester with the date 1810 engraved upon it, and a broken saucepan. Old Gedali meanders about his treasures in the rosy emptiness of evening, a little proprietor and smoked glasses and a green frock coat down to the ground. He rubs his small white hands, he plucks at his little gray beard, and listens, head bowed, to invisible voices wafting down to him. The shop was like the box of an earnest and inquisitive boy who will grow up to be a professor of botany. In this shop you could find buttons as well as a dead butterfly. Its little owner went by the name of Gedali. Everyone left the bazaar, Gedali remained. He wound in and out of a labyrinth of globes, skulls, and dead flowers, waving a bright feather duster of cock's plumes and blowing dust from the dead flowers. And here we are, sitting on beer kegs. Gedali twisting and untwisting his thin beard, his top hat swaying like a little black tower. Warm air flows past us. The sky changes colors. Delicate blood pours from an overturned bottle up there, and a whiff of decay covers me. The revolution, we will say yes to it, but are we to say no to the Sabbath? So Gedali begins and weaves around me the silken cords of his smoke-hidden eyes. Yes, I cried to the revolution. Yes, I cried to it, but it hides from Gedali and brings forth only shooting. Closed eyes don't let sunlight in, I replied to the old man, but we will unstitch those closed eyes. A pole closed my eyes, whispers the old man in a voice that was barely audible. The Pole is a mean dog. He takes the Jew and tears out his beard, the cur. And now he is being beaten, the mean dog. That is splendid. That is the revolution. And then the one who beat the Pole says to me, turn over your phonograph for registration, Gedali. I like music, Pani, I replied to the revolution. You don't know what you like, Gedali. I'll shoot at you, and then you'll know. And I cannot do without shooting, because I am the revolution. She cannot do without shooting, Gedali, I say to the old man, because she is the revolution. But the Pole, my gentle Pan, shot because he was the counter-revolution. You shoot because you are the revolution. But the revolution, that's supposed to be pleasure. And pleasure does not like orphans in the house. A good man does good deeds. So then, bad people are making the revolution. But the Poles are bad people too. So who can tell Gedali where is the revolution and where is the counter-revolution? I used to study Talmud. I love Rashi's commentaries and the books of Maimonides, and there are yet other understanding folk in Zhytomyr. And here we all are, all of us learned people, falling on our faces and crying out in a loud voice, woe unto us, where is the sweet revolution? The old man fell silent, and we saw the first star breaking through across the Milky Way. The Sabbath has come, Gedali stated solemnly. Jews should be going to the synagogue. And comrade, he said, rising, his top hat like a little black tower swaying on his head, bring a few good people to Zhytomyr. Oh, there's a shortage of good people in our town, such a shortage. Bring us kind people, and we will hand over all the phonographs to them. We are not ignoramuses. The Internationale, we know what the Internationale is, and I want an Internationale of kind people. I would like every soul to be registered and given first category rations. There, soul, eat, please, and enjoy life's pleasures. And comrade, the Internationale, you don't know what it's eaten with. It is eaten with gunpowder, I answered the old man, and spiced with the best blood. And there she was, the young Sabbath, appearing out of the blue darkness to take her throne. Gedali, I said, today is Friday, and it's already evening. Where can one get Jewish biscuits, a Jewish glass of tea, and a little of that discharged God in the glass of tea? Haven't got any, Gedali replied, hanging the padlock on his little booth. Haven't got any. Next door is a tavern, and good people used to run it, but nobody eats there now. People weep there. He buttoned his green frock coat on 3 bone buttons. He brushed himself with the cock's feathers, splashed a little water on his soft palms, and departed, a tiny, lonely dreamer in a black top hat, a large prayer book under his arm. The Sabbath is coming. Gedali, founder of an unattainable Internationale, has gone to the synagogue to pray. Zhytomyr, June 1920. My first goose. Savitsky, the Div Chief 6, rose when he saw me, and I was struck by the beauty of his giant body. He rose, and with the carmine of his breeches, the raspberry of his tilted cap, the medals pressed onto his chest, split the cottage in half like a standard splits the sky. He smelled of perfume and the sickly sweet freshness of soap. His long legs were like girls, sheathed to the shoulders in shining riding boots. He smiled at me, struck his whip on the table, and drew toward him an order that the chief of staff had just finished dictating. It was an order for Ivan Chesnokov to advance on Chuganov Dobrovodka with a regiment entrusted to him to make contact with the enemy and destroy said enemy. For which destruction, the Div Chief 6 began to write, smearing the whole sheet. I make this same Chesnokov fully responsible up to and including the supreme penalty, and will, if necessary, strike him down on the spot, which you, Chesnokov, who having been working with me on the front for some months now, cannot doubt. The Div Chief signed the order with a flourish, tossed it to his orderlies, and turned upon me gray eyes that danced with merriment. Speak, he shouted, and split the air with his whip. Then he read the order with my appointment to the staff of the division. So ordered, said the chief. So ordered, and see to his every refreshment, except full frontal. You read and write? I read and write, I replied, envying the flower and iron of that youthfulness. Graduated in law from Petersburg University. Well, don't you stink of baby powder, he burst out laughing. Glasses on his nose, too. Look at the mangy little fellow. They send us your kind without asking, but here glasses get you killed. Think you'll manage with us, eh? I'll manage, I said, and went off to the village with the quartermaster to find lodging. The quartermaster carried my trunk on his shoulder. The village street lay before us, round and yellow as a pumpkin. The dying sun in the sky gave up its pink ghost. We went up to a hut painted over with garlands. The quartermaster stopped and suddenly said with a guilty smile, a real hassle over here if you got glasses. And there's nothing you can do about it either. Over here, a person of the highest distinction is done for. But go ruin a lady, a real proper lady too, and then the troops will adore you. He hesitated, my little trunk on his shoulder. Then he came quite close to me, only to dart away again in despair and run to the nearest yard. Cossacks were sitting there on the hay, shaving one another. "Look here, troops," said the quartermaster, setting my little trunk down on the ground. "Comrade Savitsky's orders are that you're to take this man into your quarters, so no nonsense about it, because this man's been through a lot in the learning line." The quartermaster, purple in the face, left us without looking back. I raised my hand to my cap and saluted the Cossacks. A lad with long, straight flaxen hair and a lovely Ryazan face went over to my little trunk and tossed it out the gate. Then he turned to me with his rear end, and employing remarkable skill, emitted a series of shameful noises. "00 ordnance!" an older Cossack shouted at him and burst out laughing. "Run and cover!" His guileless art exhausted, the lad made off. Then, crawling on the ground, I began to gather together the manuscripts and tattered garments that had fallen out of the trunk. I picked them up and carried them to the other end of the yard. Next to the hut, perched on bricks, there was a cauldron simmering with pork, the smoke rising like the distant smoke of home in the village, mingling hunger with untold loneliness in my head. Then I covered my little broken trunk with hay, turning it into a pillow, and lay down on the ground in order to read from Pravda, Lenin's speech at the Second Congress of the Comintern. The sun fell upon me from behind the toothed hillocks. The Cossacks trod on my feet. The lad made fun of me relentlessly. The beloved phrases came toward me along a thorny path and could not reach me. Then I put aside the newspaper and went out to our host, who was spinning yarn on the porch. "Hey, you lady," I said, "food!" The old woman raised the diffused whites of her half-blind eyes and lowered them again. "Comrade," she said after a moment's silence, "all this business makes me want to go hang myself." "Why, you goddamn mother," I muttered, annoyed, and pushed the old woman in the chest with my fist. "I have to spell it out for you?" And turning around, I saw somebody's sword lying within reach. A stern-looking goose was waddling about the yard, inoffensively preening its feathers. I overtook it and pressed it to the ground. The goose's head cracked beneath my boot, cracked and oozed. The white neck lay stretched out in the dung, and the wings settled over the slaughtered bird. "Why, you goddamn mother," I said, digging into the goose with a sword. "Go on, roast him for me, lady." Her blind eyes and glasses glistening, the old woman picked up the bird, wrapped it in her apron, and took it over to the kitchen. "Comrade," she said to me after a moment's silence, "I'd like to hang myself." And she closed the door behind her. The Cossacks in the yard were already sitting around their cauldron. They sat motionless, back straight, like high priests, and disregarded the goose. "The lad will do," one of them said about me, winking and scooping up the sour cabbage soup with his spoon. The Cossacks commenced their supper with the elegant restraint of peasants who have respect for one another, while I wiped the sword with sand, went out the gate, and came back in, sick at heart. The moon hung over the yard like a cheap earring. "Little brother," Surovkov, the oldest of the Cossacks, said suddenly, "sit down and partake with us until your goose is done." He took out a spare spoon from his boot and handed it to me. We slurped up the soup they had made and ate the pork. "What's in the newspaper?" asked the flaxen-haired lad, making room for me. "In the paper, Lenin writes," I said, pulling out Pravda, "Lenin writes that there's a shortage of everything." And loudly, like a triumphant man hard of hearing, I read Lenin's speech to the Cossacks. Evening wrapped a quickening moistness of her dusky sheets about me. Evening laid her motherly hands upon my burning brow. I read and gloried, and in all my glory tried to track the mysterious curve of Lenin's straight line. "Truth tickles everyone's nostrils," said Surovkov, when I had come to the end. "But how do you pull it from the heap? Now this one, he hits it straight like a hen pecks grain." This is what was said of Lenin by Surovkov, platoon commander of the staff squadron. And then we went to bed in the hayloft. We slept, all six of us, warming one another, our legs intermingled beneath a tattered roof that let in the stars. I had dreams, and saw women in my dreams, and only my heart, imbrued with slaughter, oozed and groaned. July 1920. And here's the last one I'll read. 2 pages. The Rebbe. So, as you'll see, this is how the stories were published in order here, and you'll see that the Rebbe is a direct continuation of Gedali. So, in between Gedali and the Rebbe, wedged in, you have My First Goose. So here's where we kind of begin to think about the, the sujet, the composition of Red Cavalry as a kind of novel. The Rebbe. All is mortal, only the mother is destined for life eternal, and when the mother is not among the living, she leaves behind a memory none yet has dared to defile. The memory of the mother nourishes in us a compassion like the ocean, a boundless ocean that feeds the rivers dissecting the universe. Such were Gedali's words. He uttered them with great solemnity. The dying evening surrounded him with the rose-tinted haze of its sadness. The old man said, in the passionate edifice of Hasidism, the doors and windows have been smashed, but it is immortal like the soul of the mother. With oozing eye sockets, Hasidim still stands at the crossroads of the raging winds of history. Thus spoke Gedali, and having prayed at the synagogue, he took me to Rebbe Motala, the last Rebbe of the Chernobyl dynasty. We went up the main street, Gedali and I. White churches gleamed in the distance like fields of buckwheat. The wheel of a gun carriage groaned around a corner. A couple of pregnant chachlushki came out of a gateway jingling their coin necklaces and sat down on a bench. A shy star was kindled in the orange strife of the sunset, and peace, Sabbath peace, rested upon the crooked roofs of the Zhytomyr ghetto. Here, whispered Gedali, pointed out a long building with a broken pediment. We entered a room stony and empty like a morgue. Rebbe Motala was sitting at a table surrounded by the liars and the possessed. He wore a sable hat and a white robe cinched with a cord. The Rebbe sat with closed eyes and dug his thin fingers into the yellow fluff of his beard. From where does the Jew come? He asked and opened his eyes a little. From Odessa, I replied. A God-fearing town, the Rebbe suddenly said with remarkable force. The star of our exile, our unwished well of sorrows. What is the Jew's occupation? I am putting into verse the adventures of Hirsch of Ostropol. Great undertaking, whispered the Rebbe, and closed his eyelids. The jackal whines when he is hungry. Every fool has folly enough for despondency, and only a sage can tear the veil of being with laughter. What has the Jew studied? The Bible. What is the Jew seeking? Merriment. Reb Mordechai, said the tzaddik, and shook his beard. Let the young man take a seat at the table. Let him eat on the Sabbath eve with the other Jews. Let him rejoice that he is alive and not dead. Let him clap his hands when his neighbors dance. Let him drink wine if he is given wine. And Reb Mordechai darted over to me, a jester of old, a hunchbacked geezer with turned-out eyelids, no taller than a boy of 10. Oh, my dear and so very young man, said the ragged Reb Mordechai, winking at me. Oh, how many rich fools I used to know in Odessa. How many penniless sages I used to know in Odessa. Do sit down at the table, young man, and drink the wine you won't be given. We all sat side by side, the possessed, the liars, and the slack-jaws. In a corner, some broad-shouldered Jews who looked like fishermen and apostles were moaning over their prayer books. Gedali, in his green frock coat, was dozing by the wall like a colorful little bird. And suddenly, I caught sight of a youth behind Gedali, a youth with the face of Spinoza, the mighty brow of Spinoza, the wan face of a nun. He was smoking and shivering like an escaped man caught and returned to his cell. Ragged Reb Mordechai crept up behind him, tore the cigarette from his mouth, and ran away to me. That's the Rebbe's son, Ilya, he croaked, the bloodshot flesh of his turned-out eyelids drawing close to my face. The cursed son, the last son, the unruly son. And Mordechai shook his fist at the youth and spat in his face. Blessed is the Lord, rang out the voice of Rebbe Motala Bratzlavsky, and he proceeded to break bread with his monkish fingers. Blessed is the God of Israel, who hath chosen us from among all the nations of the earth. The Rebbe blessed the food, and we began our meal. Beyond the window, horses were neighing and Cossacks shouting. Beyond the window yawned the wasteland of war. The Rebbe's son smoked one cigarette after another amid the silence and prayers. When the supper came to an end, I was the first to rise. My dear and so very young man, Mordechai muttered behind my back, tugging at my belt. If there were no one in the world besides the wicked rich and the poor vagabonds, Then how would the holy ones live? I gave the old man some money and went out into the street. Gedali and I parted. I made my way back to the station. There, at the station, in the agitprop train of the 1st Cavalry, I was greeted by the flare of hundreds of lights, the magic brilliance of the radio station, the persistent churn of printing presses, and my unfinished article for the Red Cavalryman, July 1920. Thanks. Questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I really like your translations.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, like, as a translator, how do you know when you've gone too far with like a phrase, right? Because you have to change things as you go, but you also, like, obviously can't go too far because then you distort the original meaning. And like for you, how do you find that line?
You know, I had a friend who was a computer programmer, and he said that, you know, code is never finished; it's abandoned. So, you know, that's part of the answer.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to stop. In this case, you know, both fortunately and unfortunately because of the timing, fortunately that it happened at all. So much of the revision took place in proofs. Because
Which they'd always tell you not to do. But, like,
they always tell you, yeah, they always tell you not to do, but that's when you you know, when they send you the bound advanced reader's copies, that's when shit gets real, and you're like,
Yes.
oh my God, I don't want anyone to read
Yes.
this.
Yes.
Why did you bind this thing? This is horrible. And then I had a proofreader who went through and checked it against the Russian and asked all of his friends, and then he and I kind of negotiated a list of what was 30 pages of single-space corrections to the bound proofs. And I'm still stunned that was enough, because for the most part, every time that I read this out loud, whatever, I'm like, this is good. I stand by this. It's finished. But that happens rarely, you know. The interesting thing is that sometimes I would come up with something that was very difficult, and often I would post this on Facebook. I would be so proud of myself, like, oh, I worked on this for a week. What do you guys think? And inevitably somebody would like start picking it apart, and I would be like, oh, and then I'd be like, well, he sort of has a point. And like, you know, about 80% of the time I would change it in some way. I wouldn't change it to what that person suggested, but usually, even when someone suggests something kind of not that good, it's because they don't see something, because they see something that you didn't see, and so you're forced to reconsider it again and make it a little better. But at some point, yeah, you do have to stop. So when you've gone too far, I don't know. It's a good question. Other questions? Comments? I could keep reading. Yeah, David.
How much, like, I'm just wondering how much of the process was oral? How much
Oral?
For you?
For me, it's
constantly reading it out loud and then.
I don't know if I was reading it out loud, but I was definitely reading it out loud in my head. I definitely, that is one of my principles of composition in general, because I write poetry and I translate poetry, so to me I have to be able to kind of intone it. So it's less about the way it looks on the page than the way I read it back to myself and then compare it, and then compare it to the Russian and see if it gives me the same feeling. Mm-hmm. So yeah, for me personally, that's very important, and that's why, you know, for me, the sort of the finished mode of this book is me reading the entire thing out loud.
Right.
Pretty much.
So it's like you're translating feeling, not just words, but actually the feeling that the words produce.
And rhythm.
Rhythm, right.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah, because so for me, you know, these last three stories, of course, I never translated them, but I was so intimately connected to them while I was writing about them that I still. So I hear you reading them, and in my head, for a lot of these sentences, I get most of the Russian comes up. And I'm wondering, are you still hearing the Russian as you're reading it, or does it just become something that is now in English?
To me, that they've fused.
Mhm.
You know, when I you know what it's interesting when I'm reading it, when I'm looking at it, right? I'll often recall the Russian, but especially when I'm reading it out loud, it's more the feeling of the Russian at that point. Like I would have to think about, oh, what does the Russian actually say, and then I could retrieve it. But
Yeah. But when I look at it, in particular, what I notice and I think is so good is that just the contours of the sentences and where the commas are and the phrases and all that, not all the commas because they're different comma rules, but feels like the Russian, like maps onto the Russian sentence, not word for word, but kind of phrase for phrase.
well, that's something that I actually I think that's one of the things. That's one of the sort of more obvious things that sets my translation apart, is that I resisted correcting Babel's punctuation, which most English translations do, because Babel uses a lot of run-on sentences, and he also uses not fragments, because it's much harder to write a fragment in Russian, but he uses these sort of short, clipped sentences, often with a kind of strange, jarring repetition of the same phrase or word. And I've noticed that nearly all translators will break up or put a semicolon into his run-on sentences, or make it a compound sentence, or they will combine a chopped off sentence with another one. They will make it flow better. And I didn't want to make it flow on the visual level of grammar and punctuation. I wanted to make it flow just, when I read it out loud, but not necessarily visually. And I had to arm wrestle my copy editors every single time. So that's one.
And you have to pay attention to repetitions like with my first skrypelo и текло, the cracked and oozed. I was wondering in the last sentence of my first piece, again, I have this sort of sentence structure in my mind, but some words disappear. And when I see the word imbrued, which is not a word that I encounter much in English, I try to remember what was it in Russian? Imbrued with slaughter.
I cannot remember what the Russian word was, but believe me, it took me years to come up with imbrued.
And I suspect the Russian word was much less rare than imbrued.
It was the word. Does anyone have the Russian?
I'm
looking it up
right now because I also really want to know.
What I'm trying to remember about often what Babel does.
It's made scarlet.
It is made scarlet. It's abavirona.
Yes, I just
Abavirona.
remember that.
Yeah,
It's made
that's
scarlet.
Made scarlet. Yeah.
With,
So it's very weird. And what I like most about abavirona is the sound of it.
So
So
that's what you're
imbrued.
It's true. But
yeah.
what does imbrued mean? Is it like infused?
It's-
I don't know what it means.
It's like
It's
steeped.
it's like a real word that means exactly. It's
It actually means like rendered scarlet.
it doesn't.
You lose the color with it.
Yeah,
right?
you lose the color, but you get the sort of the sound and the feeling of being kind of like something being brewed into it.
It's
Steeped in, I would say.
it says to improve, to stain something, especially one's hands or sword.
Ah.
So it's
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah. So it, and it's obviously not a word that I ever used before but I somehow found this word, and I'm like, this word was invented
Yeah.
for me at this moment.
It also seems really important that it be one word and
Yeah.
not made scarlet. So like
Yeah,
I can totally see why you would choose.
That was my issue, is that I didn't like any version
Yeah.
of that line that I'd encountered. None.
See, I think it's a great word, but it's not perfect because it can't be perfect because it loses the red, and I think it's a fine choice, but you do lose the color. But that's not a criticism. I think you made the right choice here.
I had dreams and saw women in my dreams, and only my heart, imbrued with slaughter, oozed and groaned.
Right, the question is whether when you hear the word slaughter, you see that.
And heart, and imbrued almost has the word red in it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's
You know.
yeah. I didn't. Yeah, I went back and forth on 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 Scarlet, and it's also it's more like it's more of a burgundy. It's like emborsed with
Well, that would've been
emborsed with So there's something that I felt like Scarlet was always both. The feeling of red and scarlet was always just very wrong about that, because those are such clean words. They're so crisp, and the Russian is just, it's just the kind of oozing and staining, like like spilling borscht on yourself. Basically, it's is the feeling that I got.
Stained with it. I think you also made the right choice in keeping a locution in that same sentence that is there in the original, and I think has to stay, but could be seen as being too literal for the Russian.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had dreams and saw women in my dreams, and I think you have to do it because of the way the structure. But if I saw it separately, I saw women in my dreams, I think no, I dreamed of women. Because in Russian you see things in dreams, you see dreams. But here with the precise structure, it really can only work that way.
It's because the structure is so weird.
Yes.
It's not I dream of Jeannie.
No.
It's really strange the way they say I have dreams, and saw women in my dreams. Well, what does that mean exactly? I guess that's nice or something.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden there's this.
Yeah.
The way that it closed, right, and he sees women in his dreams right after he tells us that he's like sleeping intertwined with
yes.
Cossack legs.
Yeah,
right?
I certainly made a lot of that.
Right, in the legs that are sheathed like girls.
That's
Like,
right.
were those the
Yeah.
women that he dreamed?
Yeah.
So I felt that there's something very weird about the way that he says that he saw women in his dreams. Right, one couldn't take it at face value. So I felt that nearly, he knows when he's repeating a word and makes it sound strange, right? So
Right.
you kind of have to listen closely to him there. Like, why is he repeating that? And it's challenging to make it sound not necessarily good, but make it sound interesting, to make it sound like something other than a mistake.
Right.
So that's what I had to do.
But it certainly doesn't sound like a mistake.
Exactly.
Especially in English.
But the thing is, there's more ways to make it sound like a mistake.
Well, really, it sounds
That
like,
kind of repetition.
given your comfort with the level of syntactic and lexical weirdness, your next project should be translated Platonov.
Oh no. Other questions?
More questions or comments? I'd like to point out that we have copies of the book, if anyone would care to purchase them.
I slept in here.
He did, so you have to lighten his
Probably already
load so
won
that he can go home without hurting his back. But I'd also like to thank Val for speaking with us and doing wonderful readings of his translations.